What's up, guys? Welcome to another movie review, and this time is another movie that really caught my attention, which is sort of the requirement for me to do a review on it, because a lot of times when I watch a movie, the want for me to talk more about it ends probably about 15 to 20 minutes after we leave the theater. It takes a very specific movie for me to really want to talk a lot about it, and it's either because it really fascinates me or because the people who I associate with are not particularly interested in talking about it. Detective Pikachu was the latter, but in this case, it was primarily both. And that movie is Ford v. Ferrari, or for my international fans, Le Mans 66. So let's get started. So while this video is one of my unscripted reviews, I am going to be sort of trying to keep it in a category of story, technical and cinematography, and then my final thoughts. So without further ado, let's get right into the story. So the story in this movie follows Ken Miles, portrayed by Christian Bale, and Carroll Shelby, portrayed by Matt Damon. So we finally get to have both Jason Bourne and Batman in one movie. Not the first time that joke's been made, but whatever. But it follows these two automotive and racing legends in their fight with Ford and for Ford to win at Le Mans to beat Ferrari. Now, the actual story behind why Ford wanted to start this pissing contest of racing with Ferrari is actually really interesting in and of itself and actually happened. So back in the late 50s, early 60s, Ferrari on their end was going bankrupt and Ford was sort of stuck in the trap that a lot of automotive makers had been caught in back in the day, which was just making boring cars that weren't super exciting. Ford was pretty much making the Falcon, and it was only going to be a few years later that they were going to introduce the Mustang, but even the first-gen Mustang wasn't super interesting, so they needed something that would give them a sort of better look in the public's eye, especially for the younger generation, because those were the ones buying their cars, and in this instance, not buying their cars, because the cars they were making were boring. The idea for Ford was that they were going to purchase Ferrari in order to sort of jumpstart their racing team and have a really well done and damn near perfect automotive side for their luxury brand. Ferrari was going to be under Ford, and it would get the public's attention a little better, both internationally and in the US. Now, it's never said flat out, though I'm sure a lot of Ford executives thought this way, and many of the public thought this way. Ferrari really, at least from what it seemed, never intended to sell to Ford. They just wanted Ford's attention and the offer from Ford in order to raise their own price, so another company, in this instance Fiat, would be able to pay more, or would be willing to pay more. And as a result, Henry Ford II did not take very kindly to this at all, and therefore he started a race program to bury Ferrari at Le Mans. And it's after this moment in the movie that we see the two factors of Carroll Shelby and Ken Miles and Henry Ford II and his team of executives merging, because when they started to develop their own race team, they basically cobbled together a bucket of hopes and dreams with some horsepower under the hood and sent it out to Le Mans in 62? Sorry, it was actually 1960. This movie, and this is sort of a thing that, as somebody really into automotive racing and history, is kind of weird, but helps the story flow. They skip a lot of segments that actually happened in history because they would have kind of killed the flow of the story. They weren't really as necessary. So I understand why they skipped them. It's just sort of, not historically accurate, but this is an entertaining movie, and I'll get to that in a minute. So anyway, in 1960, they introduced the Ford GT, and from 61 to 62, right up until 63, they were racing on their own with no assistance from Carroll Shelby or development from Carroll Shelby or Ken Miles or any of them. And they, like I said, threw together a bucket of hopes and dreams and a bunch of horsepower and failed, crashed, whatever, because 24 hours of racing is hard. Hell, I wouldn't even want to run my own car for 24 hours. And so after almost 4 years of consecutive failure, they reach out to the brilliant car designer, Carroll Shelby, who has been having a ton of success up to this point in history with his AC Cobra, as well as the Daytona, which had just come out, which they sort of gloss over in the movie. You just see the design of it in the background. But he's been having massive success with these cars on the racetrack and massive success in Le Mans itself. They actually won one of their race classes in Le Mans when they entered the Daytona. This was, again, glossed over in the movie. They didn't really cover that, but that's one of the things that got the attention of Ford back in the 60s. Now, while Carroll Shelby was the sort of lead designer, he trusted a lot of his test driving in the movie to Ken Miles, because Ken Miles was, and still is, in my opinion, one of the greatest race drivers to have ever lived. And while the cars that he was driving were much more simplistic, he was one of the few racers who was actually easy on the car. I say while there's a scene going on behind me of him smashing a trunk lid in. But he was usually very easy mechanically on the car, and that was primarily because he saw himself as a mechanic first and a race car driver second. And they play into this, and they also play heavily into the way that he was fairly aggressive, which when you see old clips of the real-life Ken Miles, and you see the way that he carried himself, at least in front of the camera and during interviews, he was very calm. And watching interviews of people who worked with Ken, they were saying how they never really saw a fight or anything like that, and I would believe that. And I think the main thing was that having sort of a hothead behind the wheel like Ken Miles in the movie would help with story. And that's kind of the overall theme with this movie when it comes to the story, is they drive entertainment more than history, but in a way that still gives the people who are into that automotive history a peek at what would have happened and how things went down in a dramatic fashion while still being entertaining for the casual moviegoer. This is one of the few movies where I can actually recommend it to people who are and aren't car people, because the story behind it is solid enough that you don't really feel like it's 100% a car movie. You feel like it's a movie about overcoming odds and fighting against the man and things like that. And they do a phenomenal job of sort of portraying that, especially by, unfortunately, sort of villainizing Leo Beebe, which I don't really think that the real-life Leo Beebe was as cynical and underhanded as the movie's portrayal is, but that's a discussion that I'm not really going to get into because I don't know enough about it. Either way, the movie portrays these characters in a phenomenal light, the story is told very well, and I'm about to get into something that is spoiler related. So if you don't want to be spoiled, skip to this time here, and that will be when the spoilers are over. So with the movie being primarily about the development of the Ford GT and the story between Carroll Shelby and Ken Miles, and of course being based on real life, everything based on real life ends in death. And it's unfortunate, but it's true. This is just how life works. Nobody makes it off this rock alive. But here's the thing. When they cover it in this movie, I would have expected it to be played in a brighter light, because a lot of this movie had quite a few uplifting moments, a lot of really, really great overcoming triumphant moments, including the race at Daytona where Ken Miles won, and Sebring, they didn't really cover, but it was implied, obviously, that he had won. He was on his way to the Triple Crown, and for those of you who are familiar with this story, he was robbed of the Triple Crown back in 1966 because while he had Sebring and Daytona, he was encouraged to slow down by the Ford executives in order to make the iconic photograph of 3 Ford GT40s winning at Le Mans in a tie. However, after the flag went down, there was a formality that robbed Ken Miles of his Triple Crown, in the sense that the car that was 8 yards further back was traveling a further distance, and therefore they won. And they didn't shy away from that. And they played it up in a sort of, okay, we'll get him next time mood. And it sort of killed the emotion and sort of made you feel for these characters even more, considering you spent the entire movie watching them in this incredible and triumphant race, winning all of these other races, and then being robbed at the last second of the final big race. But that's how life actually went. Those things that they said in the movie actually happened. Ken Miles did not win Le Mans 66 because of a technicality. And it was just mind-blowing to me that they not only showed it in the movie as it would have been in most cases, but also the fact that they just dove into the emotion of these characters. We see Carroll Shelby snapping at Leo Beebe. We don't really see what Ken Miles really said, because I can assume that the one F word they dropped in this movie was all they could afford in terms of keeping the rating down. But yeah, it just put this damper on the feeling of the film, because you end up with this downer and this anticlimax at the end, and it's only driven home further by what I said earlier. So like I said, any true story ends in death. And unfortunately, not more than a few months after Le Mans 66, while Ford and Shelby were developing the J car, the follow-up to the iconic Ford GT40 that won Le Mans 66, they were testing it and it killed Ken Miles. There's still no understanding as to why. Even Carroll Shelby said that they have no idea why the car crashed. It just took off, and when it crashed, they had this theme through the movie with crashes where sometimes people don't get out, where that does sort of give a theme to the death of Ken Miles in the movie. It's not actually entirely accurate. So obviously the sometimes they don't get out part was given to the movie as a theme because earlier on in the film there was a crash with the testing of the GT40 that Ken Miles was able to get out of. But in this instance it was implied that he couldn't. In reality, it's actually a lot more tragic. The car being designed with these honeycomb patterns for lightness was extremely fragile and upon crashing broke apart and threw Ken Miles out of the car, killing him. It's really tragic, and the movie just gut punches you with this just painful reality of the dangers of race car driving and testing, especially back in the 60s, because while seatbelts were required for racing, things like roll cages were not. You could have a roll bar in an open top car, which is what you see in the Shelbys, but in terms of the Le Mans race cars, there were no requirements for overbar roll cages. So if you rolled the car and the roof wasn't ready to hold the weight of the car, you could be crushed. If the car was too light and it broke apart, you would be killed. And that's exactly what happened. And the movie doesn't shy away from that, which just blew my mind. All right, welcome back everybody who skipped the spoilers. So getting to the final thoughts on the story itself, I feel like with this movie, while they did kind of skip quite a few things that were not necessary to the story because of the overall flow, I definitely feel like while they, again, skipped things, they didn't skip what mattered. And I think that overall to the story just lends to how incredibly well it was written. And it didn't try to branch too many characters into one film. There were the executives, comprised of Hank the Deuce, Henry Ford II himself. We've got Leo Beebe, and we have Lee Iacocca acting as sort of the inside man. Each of them is sort of their own party within one group. So you have Henry Ford II, sort of the executive distanced from the group while still trying to obviously keep an eye on it, but relying on others to do that more for him. We have Leo Beebe, who, in this case, unfortunately for the real Leo Beebe, sort of the villain, constantly trying to do things to take away the win or the glory from Shelby and from Ken Miles. And we have we have Lee Iacocca, who is, again, like I said, the sort of inside man and the sort of secret fan of the fact that Shelby and Ken Miles are winning. He's the inside lead for Carroll Shelby so that he knows what's going on at Ford, since Leo Beebe doesn't want to share any of that information and just sort of drop things on Shelby. On the other side of the camp, with Shelby, we do, of course, have quite a few iconic race car engineers, drivers, all of these people introduced to some degree by name, but the primary focus is Ken Miles and Carroll Shelby. Carroll Shelby, the one dealing directly with what Ford's doing, and, of course, we have Ken Miles, the one sort of trying to make things happen despite all the odds. Plus, I just gotta say before I move on, this movie has the best attention grabber opening I have ever seen. It was covering Shelby's win at Le Mans and how he had all these heart issues and how now he wasn't actually set on fire in the real race that he won, but one of the other drivers was, and it's just, the whole opening is one of the best attention grabbers ever. Either way, the story gets a thumbs up from me. I think it is phenomenal. They skipped what they needed to without killing the flow of the movie and without making it seem sort of inconsistent. If you want to figure out what happened in Le Mans 65, though, I would look it up because they went from 64 to 66 in the movie. There was a race in between that Ken Miles did race in, but I'll leave that up to you to look it up because it wasn't in the movie and I'm not going to go into it. Now, when it comes to the way that this film was, well, filmed, James Mangold masterfully directed this movie, and the way that they portrayed the racing and the way that the overall construction of the original Le Mans track from 66 was done was just mind-blowing. So now we're going to get into the cinematography and the technical side. So the movie itself, if it wasn't actually shot on film, sure as hell feels like it was. The grain looks great. It sets the period. Everything's very sort of warm. And the only times that the color shifts from a warmer, sort of older feeling film tone is when they need to set the mood for something like a dingy office or the dark storm of a racetrack. There are so many little things that they do that are just incredibly well done to set the mood. On top of that, the actual filming of the races is incredible, from the reconstruction of iconic tracks to the use of actual tracks that still exist to feeling like you're behind the wheel with the driver. It's amazing. Actually seeing in a photograph how they filmed some of these cars and the rig that they had, it's amazing. So starting out, I guess, with the way that they filmed the races, everything was, at least as far as I can tell, everything that they could do practically was done practically. There's even a shot where one of the Ferraris crashes that was shot in the trailer, and they actually spun and crashed what I would assume was a replica Ferrari, and that just looks so cool. They even launched a car off of a cannon to actually show a crash early on in the film. It's pretty wild. The way they shot the racing was extremely clever, because not only were there points where you felt like you were inside the car, hearing all the shakes and rattles, which the sound design for that was just amazing, by the way, but you not only feel like you're in the car, but they also show points during the race, like at the last race of Le Mans 66, where you see Ken Miles actually hit the apex of two different turns, showing that he was on his game. He was following exactly the track lines the way he should. So for those of you who aren't familiar with racing, it just looks like cool shots. But for somebody who is familiar with racing lines and where you're supposed to drive when you're in a racing car, you see these lines being followed and they look perfect. Probably also helps that with Christian Bale, he actually went to race driving school. So whether he was actually behind the wheel driving or being driven by the stunt car, he was probably turning the wheel to a way that would actually sort of look correct. So that was also amazing. When it comes to the music and the sound design, I mentioned a bit earlier that the sound design for Inside the Car just nailed it. It sounded incredible, and I meant that. And there are so many little things that when you drive an old car, or you drive a cheap car, or you drive any sort of car that doesn't have a lot of sound dampening in it, you hear road noise, tire rub, rattling of loose components. If it's a car like that, the gauges were probably just slapped in on a dashboard, so you probably hear them rattling too. You hear everything. And on top of that, the music sets the tone for every scene. I don't even think, and I've had to watch this movie a couple times, but I don't really even think that I could spot a musical score unless I was told, hey, listen for it, because it just blends so well into the movie. So yeah, if you can't tell by my fanboying over the technical side of things, this movie just did a phenomenal job with the sound design, cinematography. I didn't even talk about this yet. Oh my gosh, the way that they redid Le Mans. So Le Mans in the movie isn't even how Le Mans looks now. Le Mans now is the Circuit de Bugatti, and it's not even close to what they portrayed in the movie. In the movie, and back in the 60s, the Le Mans 66 track was significantly faster, significantly more dangerous, and it was just country road. So the current Le Mans has some chicades in it. If you don't know what chicades are, if you're in a straight line, it's a small turn to kind of slow the car down pretty dramatically, actually. And they did this because the Mulsanne Straight is an area where, as cars got faster and faster and faster, cars could top out at insane speeds, which is exactly what happens in Le Mans 66. These cars are exceeding 200 miles an hour because there's no chicades. It's a long, straight road of countryside. And they show that. They show the crowds and the old design stands, the old-looking pits. They do the beautiful and unfortunately no longer a thing Le Mans start, where you actually start on the opposite side of the road from your car and have to run in and get in the car. That was so cool, and I wish that there was a race car series that did that again. But overall, the actual design really does a phenomenal job of blending visual effects with practical and not even really making you feel like you're looking at anything that is sort of visual effect-y, if that's a word. it just blends into the background so well, which is what I love about the way James Mangold directed this. You just don't feel like you're watching a visual effects heavy film because they use it so sparsely. The same thing can be said for something like the Mad Max Fury Road movie. The VFX were used so sparingly and done in ways that were so unnoticeable that, well, they just weren't noticed. And it resulted in an incredible looking track that, going back and actually watching Le Mans 66 footage, it looks so good. Obviously, they're not going to have these long sweeping shots from the movie like back in 66. They would never have something like that. But from the small segments and corners and long straights that they had cameras set up from 66, it looks spot on. I love it. And so I guess now that I've fawned over the movie enough, it's time for the conclusion. So whether you're a car person, a history buff, a race fan, a moviegoer who just wants a good story, somebody who's really into conflict in movies, whatever the case may be, this movie, and it's been said actually in interviews several times, was acted out, obviously, by Christian Bale and Matt Damon, who really have said in interviews they're not really car people, but they signed on to the movie because of the way that the stories were told. And honestly, I get it. This is the kind of movie that you can watch not knowing anything about the history of Le Mans, the history of the Ford GT, the history of Ken Miles, Carroll Shelby, or cars in general. You could be driving a white Toyota Camry that is just a road appliance and still appreciate the trials, tribulations, action, and story of this film. And in a movie landscape where we're bombarded constantly with sequels and prequels and long-running series, thank you, Marvel, where you just don't get a break from the same characters because they're constantly being reused over and over, film after film after film, it's nice to sit down and watch a film that is over. You watch it, the story is told, and it's done. And it makes me so happy that this was greenlit. It makes me so happy that it was as good as it was. And while I think that it may not really go down as a top movie of all time, I definitely think that James Mangold and the entire cast of this movie deserves having this movie go down in history as one of the best car films of all time. Because while it may not appeal to everybody, the story hopefully appeals to a majority. And the story told the way that it was, hopefully, will sort of solidify in the minds of a lot of car fans. So overall, those have been my thoughts on Le Mans 66 or Ford v Ferrari. An incredible film, whether you're into cars or not. And apart from that, thanks for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Make sure to like and subscribe. Leave a comment down below about what you guys thought if you went and saw the movie. If not, do you think you're going to go and rent it or watch it now? Rent it. What is this, freaking 1990s with Blockbuster? What do you think? Let me know in the comments. And apart from that, I'll see you guys in the next video. Make sure to be there and have a good one. In case you guys missed it in every other video that I make and every ending card that I've ever made, I do make shirts. And I've actually got quite a few really cool designs and even more coming out pretty soon. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Hopefully you guys check out a shirt. I'll be running some specials pretty soon, so if you want to wait, that's fine, because I'll be running some specials to save you some money. But otherwise, if you're into anime, you're into supporting a reviewer and that kind of stuff, and you're into cameras and whatever else, go check it out.